The morning she left, I made her coffee. That's the detail that stays with me now, not the argument we'd had the night before about the thermostat, not the way she'd folded her blouses with unusual precision at 11 p.m., not even the small, careful kiss she pressed to my cheek at the door. It's the coffee. I stood at the counter in my socks, measuring out 2 spoonfuls of the Ethiopian blend she liked, listening to the sound of her suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor in the hallway, and I felt nothing but a quiet, domestic kind of love. The ordinary love of a Tuesday morning. The love that doesn't announce itself. I didn't know yet that she wasn't going to Chicago. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 41 years old, and at the time this story begins, I had been married to Claire for 9 years. We lived in a gray and white colonial on Ashford Lane in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, the kind of street where people wave from their driveways and the mailboxes are all the same shade of black. We had 2 children, Sophie, who was 8 and obsessed with horses, and Owen, who was 6 and hadn't yet stopped believing that the moon followed our car specifically. I was a financial analyst. Claire was a senior project manager at an urban consulting firm called Meridian Group. We were, by every visible measure, fine. That word, fine. I've turned it over so many times since then that it's lost its shape entirely, like a coin rubbed smooth. Our marriage was not unhappy. That's the important thing to understand, because unhappy marriages have a certain narrative logic. The cold silences, the separate beds, the arguments that leave marks. Ours wasn't like that. We laughed at the same things. We finished each other's sentences at dinner parties. On Sunday mornings, Claire would read the arts section of the paper out loud while I made pancakes, and it was the kind of ritual so embedded in the fabric of our lives that I couldn't have imagined a Sunday without it. I thought that meant we were solid. I thought ritual was the same as roots. I was wrong about that. The trip had been planned for 2 weeks. A conference in Chicago, she said. The Meridian Group was presenting a proposal to a municipal planning committee, and Claire's team was leading the project. She'd mentioned it casually over dinner, the way you mention a dentist appointment or a parent-teacher meeting. I hadn't asked many questions. That was, I would later understand, one of my first mistakes, not the suspicious kind of mistake, but the intimate kind. The kind that says, I trust you so completely that I've stopped being curious about you. She packed on Monday night. I sat on the edge of the bed watching her, half reading a report on my laptop, and I remember noticing that she'd bought new underwear. Black, not her usual style. I noticed it the way you notice a slightly different haircut, an observation that passes through the mind without leaving a mark. She caught me looking and smiled. I needed new ones, she said simply. The elastic on the old ones had gone. Makes sense, I said, and turned back to my screen. She left Tuesday at 6:15. The kids were still asleep. I walked her to the door, and she turned back once on the front step, the October air cold and still around her, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not guilt exactly. Something quieter than guilt. Something that looked almost like sadness. I'll call when I land, she said. Safe travels, I said. And I went inside and made her coffee out of habit, poured it into her mug, the white one with the chipped rim that she'd had since grad school, and only realized what I'd done when I was already halfway through my own cup. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the street lighten slowly into gray morning, and drank both cups, one after the other. She did call when she landed. Her voice was bright and a little breathless, the way it always was when she was moving through airports. She asked about the kids. I told her Owen had eaten an entire bowl of cereal dry, without milk, and was very proud of himself. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from her stomach. And I felt a small, warm satisfaction, the feeling of a husband who has made his wife laugh from 4 states away. I had no idea, standing there in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, that she was calling from a hotel in Seattle. What makes Daniel's opening so psychologically revealing is not what he notices, but what he chooses not to examine. The new underwear, the unusual late-night packing, the unreadable expression on the doorstep. Each of these details passes through his conscious mind and is quietly dismissed. This is not stupidity. It is the natural function of a deeply held belief, the belief that his marriage is safe. When we trust someone completely, the brain performs a kind of automatic triage on incoming information, filing anything that doesn't match the existing model under irrelevant. Daniel's trust is so total that it has become a form of selective blindness. He expects ordinariness, And so ordinariness is what he sees, even when the evidence gently suggests otherwise. The chipped mug, the routine call, the laugh from the stomach. These are the textures of a life he believes in. The tragedy is that the same attentiveness that makes him a loving husband, the coffee made by habit, the awareness of her laugh, will eventually become the instrument of his undoing. He is a careful man in a situation that has quietly stopped being safe. The first 2 days passed the way days always passed when Claire was traveling. I fell into the particular rhythm of single parenthood that married people only inhabit briefly and always find both exhausting and quietly clarifying. I made lunches the night before, Sophie's with the crusts cut off, Owen's with the crusts deliberately left on because he'd recently decided crusts were the best part, with the conviction of someone who has just discovered something the rest of the world has been hiding from him. I drove the school run in the pale 7 a.m. light, the car smelling of toast and someone's forgotten gym shoe. I answered emails during the 40 minutes between drop-off and my first call of the day, sitting at the kitchen table with the second coffee growing cold beside me. Claire texted throughout the day. This was normal. She was a consistent texter, not effusive, but reliable. Short, precise messages that arrived at predictable intervals, like small structural reports on her day. Meeting ran long. Lunch was terrible. Miss you all. Sophie's recital. Did you remember to RSVP to the school? Check the app. Owen okay? He seemed a little off Monday morning. I responded dutifully, sometimes with photos. Owen at the dinner table, wearing his sister's headband because he'd lost a bet. Sophie doing homework with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Claire replied with hearts and strings of exclamation marks that felt, in retrospect, slightly more effusive than usual. As though she were performing attentiveness. As though she were trying, from a distance, to be very present. But I didn't read it that way at the time. The first thing I noticed, truly noticed, in the way that leaves a small splinter behind, was on Wednesday evening. Claire called at her usual time, around 8, after the kids were in bed. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The conference, a difficult colleague named Patrick, the fact that Chicago in October was cold in a way that felt personal. I was half listening, which I'm not proud of. I was sorting through a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, pulling out the bills and recycling the catalogs, and at some point, she said something about the hotel bar and how the cocktail menu was absurdly pretentious. The view of the lake makes up for it, though, she added. I set down an envelope. Which hotel are you at again? A beat. Half a second, maybe less. The Marriott on Michigan Avenue, she said. The one near the Art Institute. Nice, I said. Is the lake visible from your room? No, just from the bar on the top floor, she said, and moved on, quickly, to something about Patrick again. I filed it away without examining it. But something small and without a name lodged itself somewhere beneath my sternum, the way a splinter lodges, not painful yet, just present. That night I dreamed about water, not Lake Michigan, something darker and closer, without a shore. Thursday, she called twice, once in the afternoon, which was unusual, and once at the regular evening time. The afternoon call felt almost anxious in its normalcy, as if she needed to hear my voice for a reason she couldn't name. She asked about a neighbor of ours, a man named Greg Harlow who lived 3 houses down and whose wife had just had a baby. Had I seen them? Were they doing okay? I said I'd waved to Greg that morning, that he looked tired but happy. That's good, she said, too emphatically. That's really good. There was a quality to her voice I hadn't heard before. It took me several days to find the word for it. The word was rehearsed. On Friday morning, Sophie came downstairs for breakfast and asked, with the studied casualness of an 8-year-old concealing something, whether Mommy was bringing her a present from Chicago. She usually brings something, Sophie said, not looking up from her cereal. She'll bring something, I said. Daddy. Sophie looked up then. She had Claire's eyes, that precise gray-green that changed color depending on the light. Is Mommy okay? I looked at my daughter. What do you mean, sweetheart? Sophie shrugged, a gesture so elaborately casual that it was anything but. She just sounded weird when she called me yesterday, like she was in a different place. I almost said, she is in a different place, she's in Chicago. But something stopped me. She's probably just tired from the conference, I said instead. Sophie nodded and went back to her cereal. But she didn't finish it. That afternoon I was on a call with a client when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Webb, a friend of mine who worked in commercial real estate and traveled constantly for work. Marcus and I had been friends since college. The kind of easy, undemanding friendship built on shared history and the mutual agreement not to require too much of each other. His text was simple. "Hey, good conference in Chicago? Claire said you were both there this week." I stared at the screen for a long moment. "Both there?" I typed back. "I'm not in Chicago. Must have gotten confused." Marcus replied with a laughing emoji, and "My bad. Wires crossed. Catch up soon." I set my phone face down on the desk. My client was still talking. I said something appropriate. I have no memory of what it was. That evening, when Claire called, I told her I'd spoken to Marcus. "Oh, Marcus," she said lightly. "How is he?" "He's good. He thought I was in Chicago with you." "Funny, right?" "Huh," she said. A flat syllable. "Must have mixed something up." "You know Marcus?" "Yeah," I said. "I know Marcus." We talked for 14 more minutes. When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, not moving. The dishwasher was running. The sound of water moving through pipes filled the house like a quiet, domestic tide. I thought about Lake Michigan. I thought about hotel bars with pretentious cocktail menus. I thought about the view from the top floor. Then I opened my laptop and looked up the Marriott on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. I found the website in 30 seconds. I looked at the photos, the lobby, the rooms, the rooftop bar. There was no lake view. The hotel was inland, 3 blocks from the water. From the bar on the top floor, you could not see Lake Michigan. I closed the laptop. I didn't sleep well that night. The second part of Daniel's story is a masterclass in how betrayal conceals itself in plain sight. None of the individual details here would be alarming in isolation. A half-second pause, an enthusiastic text, a child's vague unease, a friend's confused message. But together, they begin to form a pressure that Daniel can't yet name. The accumulation effect works precisely because each piece seems deniable on its own. The brain, desperate to maintain its existing model of reality, processes each anomaly separately and dismisses it. It is only when the hotel detail fails, the specific, verifiable lie about the lake view, that the accumulated weight of smaller doubts suddenly has somewhere to land. This is the mechanism of slow-burn betrayal, not a single explosive revelation, but a series of hairline fractures that one day, without warning, become a single break. Daniel is not naive. He is simply human, and the human mind protects its attachments until the evidence makes protection impossible. She came home Saturday evening. I had decided, with a deliberateness that cost me something, to say nothing about the hotel. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I moved. A professional habit of mine that had served me well in finance and would now, I hoped, serve me in something far more personal. You don't react to incomplete data. You gather more. You build the full picture before you act. So, when Claire walked through the door at 7 p.m., rolling her carry-on behind her, I kissed her on the cheek and took her bag and told her the kids were upstairs. She smelled different. Not dramatically, no foreign cologne, nothing so obvious. Just slightly different. The way a room smells different when someone has opened a window while you were away. A subtle displacement of the familiar. She hugged Sophie first, long and tight, the way people hug after guilt. Then Owen, who immediately demanded to know if she'd brought him something. She had, a small stuffed bear from what appeared to be an airport gift shop, its tag still on. Chicago, Illinois, the tag read, in blue script over a skyline silhouette. I noticed that the bear's tag had been handled. The edges were soft, as though it had been folded and unfolded, as if the tag had been transferred from something else. But I didn't say that. I put her suitcase in the bedroom and went downstairs to finish making dinner. Over the following week, I watched her with the careful, peripheral attention of a man who is trying not to be caught watching. I didn't go through her phone. I didn't check her email. There's a version of this story where I become someone who installs tracking software and hires a private investigator within 48 hours, but that wasn't me. Partly because I was afraid of what I'd find. Partly because I still, in some stubborn, aching chamber of myself, wanted to be wrong. What I noticed instead was this. She started going to the gym in the evenings. This was new. Claire had always been a morning exerciser, 6:30, 3 times a week, before the kids woke up. Now she was going at 7 p.m., after dinner, and coming home just before 9. She was quieter than usual when she got back. Not unhappy quiet. Somewhere else quiet. Her phone, which she had always left charging on the kitchen counter, migrated to the bedroom. She said the outlet in the kitchen was acting weird. I checked it. It worked fine. She started a new habit of closing the bathroom door when she showered. This sounds trivial, and perhaps it was. We'd been together long enough that privacy in that particular sense had largely dissolved. But it was new. The closed door. The 12 extra minutes of steam. One evening I walked past the bedroom and heard her laughing. A low, private laugh, the kind I associated with intimate conversations. I knocked and opened the door. She was on the phone, and she ended the call with a smooth, unhurried, "I'll call you tomorrow," that told me nothing except that she'd had time to compose herself before I opened the door. "Who was that?" I asked. "Rachel," she said. Rachel was her college roommate, a graphic designer in Boston. Entirely plausible. "She's having drama with her landlord again." I said. "Tell her hi from me." "I will," she said, and smiled. A warm, uncomplicated smile that I had loved for 9 years and that now felt, for the first time, like something I was looking at through glass. I called Rachel myself 3 days later. I made it casual. I had her number because we were friendly, and I called under the pretext of wanting to know if she'd heard of a particular Boston restaurant that a colleague had recommended. We chatted for 10 minutes. She mentioned Claire once, briefly, in passing, something about how they hadn't caught up in a while. She'd been meaning to call. Hadn't caught up in a while. I got off the phone and stood in my office with my hand flat on the desk, pressing down hard enough to feel the edge of the wood. Outside the window, a neighbor's kid was riding a bike in slow circles on the cul-de-sac. Round and round. Going nowhere and back again. The subplots around me were shifting too, in ways I was only beginning to understand. Our neighbor Janet Hollis, a warm, perceptive woman in her late 50s who sometimes watched the kids when we were both stuck at work, had been quieter than usual around me for weeks. I'd attributed it to the fact that her husband, Ken, had been dealing with some kind of health scare. But one afternoon when I dropped the kids at her house and she walked me back to the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful compassion. "Daniel," she said, and then stopped. "What is it, Janet?" She shook her head. "Nothing. You look tired. Make sure you're eating." I looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between us that I couldn't name, and then she smiled and closed the door, and I stood on her front step in the November cold wondering what she knew and had decided not to tell me. There was also the matter of Marcus. After his confused text, he'd gone strangely quiet. Unusual for a man who texted with the frequency and randomness of a bored teenager. When he did reply to messages, his responses were short. Once, when I suggested getting dinner, he said he was slammed and left it there. Marcus was never slammed. Marcus made time for things. His sudden scarcity felt like the particular avoidance of someone who knows something they wish they didn't. I began, carefully, to look at the details of the Chicago trip. The conference was real. I confirmed that much with a basic search. The Meridian Group had indeed presented to a Chicago planning committee, and Claire's name was in the project documentation on the firm's website. But the conference had run Wednesday and Thursday. She'd left Tuesday and come back Saturday. That was 4 nights, not 2. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a woman who needed 4 days for a 2-day conference. I thought about new black underwear and a closed bathroom door and a laugh I'd heard through a wall that didn't belong to me. I thought about a stuffed bear with a soft-edged tag in a hotel that didn't have a view of the lake. I thought, she was somewhere for 4 days. The conference accounted for 2 of them. Where was she for the other 2? And then I thought, stop. You don't know anything yet. Build the full picture. But that night, for the first time in our marriage, I lay awake listening to my wife breathe beside me and felt like a stranger in my own bed. Daniel is now in the grip of what psychologists call motivated reasoning, the tendency to pursue evidence that confirms a growing suspicion while simultaneously searching for reasons to doubt it. His observation of Claire is meticulous, but he processes each detail through 2 contradictory filters: the filter that says something is wrong and the filter that says I might be imagining this. This dual processing is exhausting, and it explains why he chooses peripheral observation over direct confrontation. The phone on the bedroom counter, the closed bathroom door, the changed gym routine. Individually, these are nothing. Collectively, they form a pattern his mind already understands but refuses to fully articulate. What's most revealing is what he focuses on versus what he avoids. He confirms the conference dates. He calls Rachel. He examines the bear's tag. But he does not look at her phone. The avoidance is not cowardice. It is the last act of a man protecting a reality he isn't yet ready to lose. I'm not a man who is comfortable with surveillance. I say that not to make myself sound noble. I'm not sure it's a virtue, exactly, but because it's true, and it mattered. The idea of going through Claire's phone felt like a violation of something I'd always considered fundamental. The privacy that exists even inside a marriage, the understanding that trust means not checking. For 9 years, I'd held to that principle with a kind of pride. I'd never read her messages, never opened her laptop while she slept, never questioned a girl's weekend or a late work dinner. Now I was sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning, and the principle felt like a wall I'd built to keep myself safe rather than a moral position. And walls, I was learning, can keep things in as well as out. I started with what I could verify without touching her personal devices. The Meridian Group's website listed their team by project. I went through the Chicago proposal documentation carefully. Claire was named as project lead. There were 3 other team members, 2 junior consultants I didn't recognize, and a senior strategist named Elliot Vance. I looked up Elliot Vance. He had a profile on the firm's site, mid-40s, strong jaw, degrees from Georgetown and Columbia. He joined Meridian 8 months ago, transferring from a firm in Seattle. Seattle. I sat with that word for a moment. Let it settle. I searched his name more thoroughly. LinkedIn showed a career history, 10 years in Seattle, then a move to Portland for the Meridian position. His profile photo showed a man who looked like the kind of man who made other men feel slightly insufficient without meaning to. I knew the type. I worked with them. They moved through rooms with a comfortable, unconscious authority that came from never having had a reason to doubt themselves. I clicked through his connections. Claire's profile was there. Connected. The connection date was 8 months ago, which aligned exactly with his arrival at Meridian. That meant nothing in itself. They worked together. But I noticed that his profile showed 43 mutual connections with Claire, which seemed high for a colleague she'd mentioned exactly once, briefly, as the new strategist. I put the laptop away. I wasn't going to construct a case from LinkedIn connections. That was the road to madness. What I did instead was practical and, I told myself, proportionate. The following Tuesday, Claire told me she was going to a late dinner with a client, one of those semi-regular professional events that I'd never had any reason to question. She left at 6:30, dressed well, smelling of the perfume she wore for work occasions. I put the kids to bed. Then I drove to the restaurant she'd named, a place called Olcott on Morrison Street that I knew because we'd been there for my colleague's retirement dinner. I parked across the street and sat in the car for 40 minutes. She wasn't there. I could see the entrance clearly, the soft gold light of the windows, the handful of people coming and going. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I sat in the dark of my car while the heater ticked and the street lights came on one by one along Morrison, and I thought about all the ordinary Tuesdays of my marriage and what they might have contained that I'd never questioned. She came home at 10. She smelled like wine and something else I couldn't identify. She kissed me on the cheek and said the dinner had been tedious but necessary. I made a sound that she took for sympathy. 2 days later, while Claire was at work and the kids were at school, I sat down with our shared credit card statement, which I had legitimate access to because I managed our household accounts. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I was looking for patterns. What I found was this. In the past 3 months, there were 7 charges at a restaurant called Luca on the east side that I had no memory of. 4 charges at a wine bar called the Meridian Cellar, not affiliated with her firm, despite the name, on evenings when she'd told me she was at the gym. A hotel charge from 6 weeks ago, the Hotel Deluxe on Southwest 15th, that I had no explanation for. The charge was for one night, a Wednesday, $289. I thought about Sophie asking whether Mommy sounded like she was in a different place. She had been. She literally had been. Here is where the red herrings complicated things, and where I'm most grateful that I was slow rather than fast. Because at the same time that I was building this quiet, careful case, 2 other things were happening that confused me badly. The first was Greg Harlow, our neighbor with the new baby. Greg came to the door one Saturday morning, looking uncomfortable, and said he needed to tell me something. His wife, Dana, had mentioned to Claire, in what she'd thought was confidence, that Greg had been seeing a therapist. For depression, he'd asked Dana not to tell anyone, and Dana had told Claire, and he was worried it might go further. He was asking me, awkwardly, man to man, to keep it between us. I told him, of course. I felt terrible for him. And I spent the next 3 days half convinced that the secret Janet Hollis had been protecting, and the reason Marcus had gone quiet, was something to do with Greg. Perhaps they'd heard something about his mental health, were protecting his privacy, and felt strange around me because Dana had told Claire and they weren't sure how much I knew. I followed that thread for a week. It went nowhere. It was nothing, or rather, it was something entirely separate from what I was looking for. A man's private struggle, dressed up by my suspicious mind as a clue. The second false lead was a man named Thomas Kirby, a client of Claire's who had been calling her frequently over the past month. I found his number in our home phone's call log. Old-fashioned, I know, but we kept the landline for the kids. He'd called 4 times in 2 weeks, always in the early evening. I researched him, found his firm, confirmed he was a legitimate Meridian client with an active project. Entirely above board. But for 10 days he'd occupied a significant portion of my suspicion, pulling me away from the actual answer. The actual answer was simpler and more devastating than either of those diversions. It came from Janet. I went to see her on a Thursday afternoon, alone. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, I looked at her and said, as simply as I could manage, "Janet, I need you to tell me what you know." She held the door for a long moment. Then she stepped back and let me in. We sat in her kitchen, and she made tea she knew neither of us would drink. She told me in a careful, pained voice that 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday afternoon, she had seen Claire getting into a car on the corner of Ashford and Maple. Not our car, not a rideshare. A man was driving. Janet described him, mid-40s, dark hair, driving a dark green Volvo. She'd thought nothing of it at first. Then she'd seen it again, the following Tuesday, at the same corner. This time she'd happened to see the man's face. She recognized him, she said, because she'd seen him at the Meridian Group's neighborhood open house the previous spring. His name, she said she'd learned from the name tag, was Elliot. The house was very quiet when she said it. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear my own breathing. I thanked Janet. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock, and then I went inside and made dinner for my children and helped Owen with his reading homework and tucked Sophie in and listened to her tell me about a horse she'd read about in class. And I did all of it with the mechanical precision of a man who is holding something very heavy and cannot yet set it down. Daniel's investigation is a vivid demonstration of how confirmation bias and distraction operate simultaneously. The Greg Harlow episode and the Thomas Kirby lead are psychologically crucial. They reveal how readily the suspicious mind latches onto any available explanation that isn't the true one. Both leads were real situations that existed in Daniel's life, and both temporarily absorbed his focus because the alternative, that his wife was conducting a deliberate, sustained affair with a colleague, was too structurally complete to be comfortable. The brain prefers incomplete explanations it can still investigate over complete ones it cannot escape. Daniel's deliberateness, which he frames as professional caution, is also a form of psychological self-protection. As long as he is still building the picture, he doesn't have to act on it. The moment Janet speaks Elliot's name, the picture is complete. And completeness is the thing he has been both seeking and dreading. What follows is not relief. It is the specific, shattering weight of having been right. I chose a Saturday. I chose it because the children would be at a birthday party, Sophie's friend Mia, 2 hours at an indoor climbing gym, which meant Claire and I would be alone in the house for the first time in what felt like months. I had arranged everything with a quietness that surprised me. I had booked the kids into the party, confirmed the carpool with another parent, and made sure Claire had no plans until late afternoon. I had thought through what I wanted to say and what I didn't. I had also, the night before, done the one thing I had resisted for weeks. I had looked at her phone. I want to be precise about this. I am not proud of it. But I had reached a point where I needed to know the full truth before I spoke. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I needed to be certain I wasn't going to be talked out of it. I knew, with the self-knowledge of a man who has loved someone for 9 years, that if I confronted Claire with a partial picture, she would find the gaps and fill them with plausible explanations, and some exhausted, devoted part of me would want to believe them. So I looked. What I found was, in its way, both more and less than I expected. The texts with Elliot Vance were not explicit. They had been careful about that, or careful enough. But they were unmistakable. The cadence of the language, the private vocabulary that had developed between them, the references that were opaque to me, but clearly meaningful to them. The usual place, Tuesday, and last night was, and I keep thinking about, and once, simply, I miss you already. There was a thread about the hotel in Seattle. He had stayed for both nights of the conference, and the additional 2 nights after it ended. There was a message from Claire, sent at 11 p.m. on what would have been the Wednesday of her trip, that read, "This doesn't feel wrong." That's what scares me. I read that sentence several times. Then I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, and went downstairs and made coffee and waited for morning. On Saturday, after the kids left, Claire came into the kitchen in her weekend clothes, soft gray sweater, jeans, her hair loose, and poured herself coffee, and I was already at the table. I had a folder in front of me. Inside it were the credit card statements, printed, with the relevant charges highlighted. I had the hotel confirmation for the deluxe. I'd found the booking confirmation forwarded to her personal email account, which I could access because I knew the password, one she'd never changed. I had, written on a single sheet of paper, the dates, the 4 nights in Seattle, the Tuesday evenings, the late dinners. I had Janet's account, summarized in a few sentences. I had, at the bottom, the name, Elliot Vance. I didn't have the texts. I wasn't going to tell her I'd read them. That was my line, and I held it. Claire sat down across from me with her coffee. She looked at the folder. Something shifted in her face, not shock, exactly. More like the settling of something that had been suspended for a long time. "Daniel," she said. "I know about Elliot," I said. The kitchen was very bright on Saturday mornings. October sunlight came through the east window at an angle that illuminated the dust on the counter and the small handprints Owen had left on the cabinet door, the ones I kept forgetting to clean. I was aware of all of it with a heightened, peculiar clarity, as though my senses had decided this moment required complete documentation. She set her mug down. She didn't cry. I had expected tears, and the absence of them taught me something. "How long?" I asked. 7 months, she said. 7 months. The conference in Seattle had not been the beginning. It had been somewhere in the middle. The beginning had been 8 months ago, 1 month after Elliot Vance joined Meridian, 1 month after the LinkedIn connection, long before the fake trip and the new underwear and the hotel on Southwest 15th. I sat with that. Was it? I stopped. Tried again. "Is it serious?" She looked at me with those gray-green eyes that Sophie had inherited. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think it is." That single syllable. Yes. I had prepared for many answers. It was a mistake. It meant nothing. I was confused. "I love you. It's over." I had not quite prepared for yes. "I think it is." For the possibility that I was not dealing with a lapse, but with a reorientation. That somewhere in the past 7 months, Claire had fallen in love with someone else while still living inside our life. I looked at the handprints on the cabinet door. "Do the kids know?" I asked. "Of course not," she said, sharply, and then caught herself. "No. Daniel. No. Does anyone know?" She hesitated. "Janet," I said. I didn't know she'd seen us. "And Marcus." Something crossed her face. "Marcus. He knew you weren't in Chicago," I said. "I think Elliot might have told someone, and it got back to Marcus. He's been strange with me for weeks." I paused. "Did you tell Elliot that Marcus was my friend?" "Yes," she said. "Then, I'm sorry. About Marcus. Of all the things to apologize for." I almost wanted to laugh. "What do you want to happen now?" I asked. She looked at her hands. "I don't know. I didn't plan this, Daniel. I need you to know that. I didn't go looking for this." "No," I said. "I know. It found you." She looked up. Something in my tone had landed. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks," I said, keeping my voice level. "I've been watching you come home from a gym you weren't at, and close bathroom doors, and move your phone, and lie about hotel views. I've been watching you hold our daughter and text this man from the next room. I've been sitting at this table every morning making you coffee and watching you be someone I don't recognize, and I want you to understand something." I placed my hand flat on the folder. "I am not angry right now. I am something past anger. I'm on the other side of it. And I need you to hear what I'm about to say without interpreting it as anything other than what it is." She was completely still. "I'm not going to fight for you," I said. "I'm not going to ask you to choose. I'm not going to go through 6 months of therapy and late-night conversations trying to understand what I did wrong or what we can do differently. Because I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks, and the thing I keep coming back to is this. Somewhere in the past 7 months, you decided that the life we built together wasn't enough. And you didn't tell me. You didn't come to me and say I'm unhappy, or I'm confused, or something's happening that I need to talk about. You just built another world alongside this one, and let me go on making coffee for someone who wasn't really there. Claire's jaw was tight. She was close to crying now, though still holding it. That, I said, is what I can't get past. Not the other man. The other life. She said, very quietly. I didn't know how to tell you. I know, I said. And I did. I believed her. Which was, somehow, the hardest part. We sat for a while in the bright October kitchen, not speaking. The coffee grew cold. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly on the street, its stereo playing something I couldn't make out. I'll move into the guest room, I said finally. We'll tell the kids something age-appropriate, and we'll get a family therapist to help with that. You'll stay in the house for now, for the kids' stability. I'll start looking for my own place. We'll do this properly and without ugliness, because whatever else has happened, we have 2 children who deserve parents who can be in the same room. She was crying now, silently, the tears moving down her face without drama. Daniel, she said. I'm sorry. I know, I said again. I stood up. I took my coffee cup to the sink. I rinsed it and set it on the rack and dried my hands on the dish towel and hung it back on the handle of the oven door. I'm going to get some air, I said. I'll be back before the kids. I picked up my jacket and walked out the front door into the pale autumn light. The confrontation scene is extraordinary for what it refuses to do. Daniel does not raise his voice. He does not demand or plead. He does not use the information he holds, the phone texts, as a weapon. This is not restraint born of weakness. It is restraint born of a fundamental shift in power. For 6 weeks, Claire has held the information and Daniel has been in the dark. Now the dynamic has completely reversed, and Daniel handles it with a precision that is both devastating and dignified. His most powerful statement, the other life, not the other man, reframes the betrayal in a way Claire cannot deflect or minimize. He is not accusing her of passion or weakness. He is accusing her of a sustained, deliberate choice to deceive. The absence of anger, which he himself notes, is the most psychologically complex element of the scene. Anger would have given Claire something to respond to, an emotion to match or deflect. What Daniel offers instead is clarity, and clarity, in this context, is the thing that closes doors. I walked for 2 hours. Not purposefully, not toward anywhere in particular. I went down Ashford Lane and turned left on Maple and kept going until the neighborhood opened up into the park along the river, the one with the jogging path and the wooden benches and the stand of Douglas firs that had been there long before any of the houses. November had stripped most of the color from the trees, and the few leaves still clinging to the upper branches were the dark, stubborn gold of things that haven't yet accepted their ending. The river was low and clear, moving over smooth stones with a sound that was, depending on the moment, either soothing or unbearably indifferent. I sat on a bench and watched it. I had thought, in the weeks of building toward that morning, that the confrontation would feel like a rupture, violent and explosive, the kind of scene that lives in the body as a before and after. It didn't feel like that. It felt more like a diagnosis that confirms what the patient already knows. The disease was there before the doctor named it. The naming doesn't cause the illness. It just ends the possibility of pretending otherwise. I thought about Claire at 26, the first time I saw her, at a mutual friend's housewarming, pouring wine and arguing cheerfully about urban planning policy with someone she'd just met, completely at home in any room she walked into. I had thought, there is a person who knows exactly who she is. I had loved that certainty in her. It turned out that certainty can shift, can become something else without the person who relied on it being told. I thought about the 9 years. I didn't catalog them as losses. That surprised me. I thought about Sophie's birth, the 31 hours, the way Claire had looked at me in the final hour, past exhaustion into something raw and foundational. I thought about the summer we'd rented a cabin in the Cascades and Owen had been too and had spent 3 days running into the shallow lake in his diaper, shrieking with joy, and Claire and I had sat on the dock in the late afternoon, watching him and not needed to say anything. I thought about the ordinary Sundays, the pancakes, the arts section. These things were real. They had happened. They would not unhappen. But they were also, now, the past. And the past, I was discovering, is not the same thing as a foundation. You cannot live in it. You can only take what it has made of you and carry that forward. In the weeks that followed, the life I had known reorganized itself in the particular, exhausting way of ended marriages. Slowly, practically, with paperwork. I moved into the guest room as promised, and then, 3 weeks later, into a two-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District that had a view of the park and was close enough to Ashford Lane that I could be at the kids' school in 11 minutes. I measured everything in children distances now, everything oriented around Sophie and Owen, whose stability became the fixed point around which my entire reconfigured life arranged itself. Sophie took it harder than Owen, as I'd known she would. She was old enough to understand that something had broken and young enough not to have the vocabulary for it. She cried for 2 weeks, the kind of crying that was mostly silence with occasional storms, and she moved between our two homes with a seriousness that was heartbreaking. But she also, slowly, began to adapt, the way children adapt to terrain, finding footholds where adults see only cliff face. By December, she was arranging her books in my apartment with the authority of someone claiming territory, and that small act of possession was the most reassuring thing I witnessed in those months. Owen, at 6, understood less and accepted more. He seemed primarily interested in the fact that my new apartment had a dishwasher with a window in it, a transparent door through which you could watch the water swirl, and he treated this as a significant upgrade. Marcus called in December. He called, and he didn't begin with an explanation. He just said, "I should have told you. I didn't know how, and that's not a good enough reason. I'm sorry, Daniel." I told him it was okay, and I meant it mostly. Some friendships require renegotiation after events like these, and ours did. We're still finding its new shape. But the friendship itself survived, which matters. Janet, I thanked properly. I brought her flowers, which embarrassed her, and she made me sit in her kitchen for an hour and eat the shortbread she'd made and talk about the kids. She said, always liked me. I told her that helped. Elliot Vance was, as far as I allowed myself to know, a presence in Claire's life that I did not investigate or monitor or think about more than I could help. This required discipline. I will be honest. I looked him up twice in the months that followed, read his LinkedIn profile, and experienced the particular degradation of comparing myself to a stranger. I stopped after the second time. What he had or hadn't taken from me wasn't something that lived in his profile photo. It lived in me, and I was working on it. The divorce process was civil. Claire and I had committed to that, and we held to it with the grim, collaborative focus of people who have decided that their children's well-being is worth their own discomfort. We used a mediator, not opposing lawyers. We divided things without warfare. There were hard conversations, many of them, but they happened in the mediator's office or over the phone, in controlled circumstances, with the children asleep and the sharper emotions kept, by mutual agreement, out of the rooms where our kids breathed. I am not going to tell you I was fine. The word fine had, by then, lost all meaning for me anyway. I was functional. I was present. On the mornings when Owen needed me, and Sophie needed me, and my clients needed me, and the apartment needed groceries, and I had slept 4 hours because my mind wouldn't stop moving. On those mornings I did what I had always done. I made coffee, and I kept going. Not because I was strong in any extraordinary sense, but because the alternative was to stop, and stopping felt like a luxury I couldn't yet afford. What surprised me, somewhere around February, was something I hadn't anticipated, a quality of lightness. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something underneath the grief that had been there all along, covered over by years of a life that had required me to be half of something instead of whole. In the evenings, after the kids were with Claire or asleep in my apartment, I began to rediscover a self I'd forgotten. Not the self I was before Claire, but a self that had been developing quietly inside the marriage, unattended, like a plant in a back room. I read things I'd been meaning to read for years. I took a weekend hiking trip in the gorge with 2 colleagues who had become, without my quite noticing, genuine friends. I cooked things that were only for me, dishes too spicy or too obscure for the family palate, and ate them at the kitchen counter looking out at the park lights, and felt, with increasing frequency, something I can only call intact. The last thing I want to say about Claire is this. She was not a villain. I want to be careful about that, not because it protects her, but because it's true, and the truth is the only thing I have left that is entirely mine. She was a person who found herself in a life she'd outgrown, and instead of doing the difficult, painful, necessary thing, which was to tell me, to give us the chance to change or to end things with honesty, She made a series of choices that compounded themselves over 7 months into something she couldn't undo. She will have to live with that. That's not my burden anymore. Mine is different. Mine is the question of what I do with the years ahead of me. The 50s I'm approaching, the children who are becoming themselves at speed, the man I am when no one is watching. The answer to that question is, I've discovered, more interesting than I expected. The grief is real and it visits me at unpredictable times. In the middle of the grocery store, or during Owen's bedtime, when the quiet of the apartment afterward is a specific shape of alone. But grief and growth have always occupied the same space. That's not a lesson. It's just what I've found. On the last Sunday of February, I made pancakes. Just for me and the kids, it was my weekend. I put on a record, something I'd been listening to alone in the evenings, a singer Owen had decided he liked because he sounds like someone's dad, and Owen sat on the counter while I worked, asking questions about how batter becomes solid, and Sophie read at the table with her tongue between her teeth. And the winter light came through the kitchen windows of my small apartment and filled the room with something that was not quite what I'd lost, but was entirely its own. I looked at my children. I felt, very clearly, the weight of what I'd carried and the fact that I was still standing under it. For the first time in months, I thought, this is mine. Not recovered, not repaired, not what it was, but mine. The resolution of Daniel's story is defined not by what he regains, but by what he discovers. The moment of realization, which arrives not in the confrontation but in the quiet of his February kitchen, is the story's true emotional climax. It is the moment when survival becomes something larger than endurance. What is most psychologically sophisticated about Daniel's arc is that he refuses both extremes. He does not collapse into victimhood, nor does he perform a triumphant recovery. He occupies the honest, difficult middle ground of a person who has been genuinely damaged and is genuinely rebuilding, on different foundations, toward a different future, but without the denial that would make the grief false. His refusal to demonize Claire is not weakness. It is the hardest form of clarity, because it closes the escape route of righteous anger and forces him to sit with the more complicated truth. The pancakes on Sunday morning, the same ritual, now stripped of its old meaning and filled with new, represent not a return, but a transformation. He has lost a version of his life. He has not lost himself. Daniel's story is, at its deepest level, a story about the difference between a life and a self, and what happens when we confuse one for the other. For 9 years, Daniel's identity was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of his marriage that he had stopped asking whether the fabric still fit. He measured the health of his life by its rituals, the coffee, the pancakes, the Sunday paper, without asking whether the people performing those rituals were still the people who had created them. Claire, for her part, had undergone a transformation she couldn't communicate, perhaps because she didn't fully understand it herself until it had already taken a shape she couldn't undo. The universal truth this story illuminates is one that every long relationship eventually confronts. Intimacy, sustained over time, requires continuous renegotiation. The couple who marries at 30 is not the same two people at 40. The assumptions we make at the beginning, about who we are, who we need each other to be, what the future looks like, calcify into facts unless we keep examining them. When we stop examining them, we stop seeing each other. And people who feel unseen will, eventually, seek to be seen, somewhere, by someone, at any cost. The cost here was immense. But what Daniel's story ultimately argues, not by declaring it, but by demonstrating it through the specificity of his experience, is that the self survives the loss of the life. That the man who made coffee by habit and drove school runs in pale morning light and held something very heavy for a very long time is not diminished by what happened to him. He is, in the end, more clearly himself. And that clarity, arrived at through grief, not despite it, is perhaps the most honest kind of beginning there is.